Hi, I'm David, and I'm very glad to be here tonight. I'm a better writer than I am a speaker, and so I thought I would just share some essays out of my book and kind of give a little context between essays. So when I was incarcerated, I walked into prison, as he said, as a white supremacist. And I rose quickly through the ranks into the prison gangs and ended up calling shots in two different prisons, in a maximum security prison and in a minimum security prison. And I was in closed custody for 5 years. And it was during that time that I came to realize that who we are today, we don't just wake up who we are today. We're kind of cobbled together bit by bit, piece by piece, through our experiences. And I had never realized that simple truth before. And so it was my own childhood trauma that had led me on the path that I was on. And I realized that my experiences as a young person, as a child, the trauma that I suffered, I was sitting in a segregation cell, and I was able to trace my steps all the way back to my childhood. And so I have to warn people, some of the stuff that's in this book, and one of the essays I'll read tonight, could be hard to listen to, but it's the truth. And it's something that I have to speak, because it's what set me on my journey and got me where I was. And recognizing that is what saved me. So what I'll read first is the introduction to the book, just to give you a little idea of how the book came about. I was born in 1969, a time when words like peace and love were sprawled across banners and marched through the streets of American cities, shouted over megaphones and whispered in silent solidarity. But for me, concepts like peace and love were always a mystery, often painful, strange, and unpredictable. I grew up just outside of town in a place called Eugene, Oregon, in the Pacific Northwest. Our home was surrounded by trees and secrets, each casting shadows on our lives, each standing tall enough to scratch the sky, with roots tapping deep into the heart of the landscape, deep enough to anchor them in place for a lifetime. I was the only boy, the middle child of 3, until my mother married her 4th husband, who brought another sister into the fold. My mother was young and beautiful, but with her beauty came a hardness, a strength that was forged from betrayal. And if there was a theme to our life, it was betrayal. I remember being a child, thin and frail, laying on my back in the bathtub with my face under the water. I would sink to the bottom of the tub, leaving my breath outside my body to cling to the ceiling like a cry for help as I laid there, resisting the urge to fill my aching lungs with bath water. I would pinch tight my eyes with all my strength and think about the numbness of death as I thirsted for air, testing my courage until my ears would ring. I don't believe I was trying to die. Maybe I was trying to live, trying to purge away the secret pain that held my head below the waterline. As I grew into a young man, the pain grew with me, weighting me down, pulling my head below the surface until I was forced to drown the world to save myself. What you hold in your hands is my rebirth, a small piece of my life, a blink of an eye, a few steps along a stumbling journey of change. This is my story, or a piece of it anyways, written from a prison cell where I'm serving out a 20 to life sentence for murder. This is a story that's hard to read and even harder to tell, about how I was introduced to the world through betrayal, and how I held that betrayal deep inside me by lashing out at a world through hate and violence. This is also a story of change, and how I eventually found hope through compassion while living out years of my life in a segregation cell. I was once a racist, a skinhead, and a white supremacist gang leader, but now I have dedicated my life to working against everything that I once believed in. In the summer of 2020, after serving 17 years in prison, I started a blog. I had no idea what a blog was. I had never read one or seen one, but with the help of someone on the outside, I started sharing my story with the outside world. Each week, I would pour my heart out to a world of strangers, and over the course of that year, through my writing, I was able to find my voice. I spoke about things for the first time in my life. unspeakable things that happened to me in childhood, things that shaped and molded me into the man that I became. I spoke about the loneliness of isolation, the violence of prison gang wars, and the crushing guilt of coming to terms with the man that I had become. Towards the end of that year, I lost my son in a car accident, but I kept writing, using my voice, no matter how difficult it became. I shared the helplessness, the grief, and the guilt that consumed me as I tried to work through this agonizing moment in my life. And in the end, I was able to share my triumph. At the end of that year, I was approached by a publisher who wanted to turn those weekly blogs into a book of short essays. What you are about to read are those essays. It's my hope that something in my story might give people hope of their own. I want them to know that change is possible, especially those who are sitting their lives away in the same cells where I have sat. I want to show those who struggle under the weight of gangs and violence that there is a way out. I want to give hope to those who hate, but who deep inside feel a quiet shame for who they are and what they have become. I hope these words reach deep into the darkest prison cell and fall upon the hardest of hearts. I want to show the world that hate and racism is very much alive and well, and if we can come together and lend our voices to those who have none, then we can be that change. I have to believe that if my voice can touch the world, then yours can too. I sincerely believe that if we speak out and we reach out, then we can change the hate. After much consideration, I have decided not to mention the crimes that I have committed which brought me to prison. I simply see no way of speaking about such things without running the risk of re-victimizing the people that I have hurt. I've come to realize that there are parts of my story that no longer belong to me. I have forever inserted myself in the lives of those that I have victimized. So my story is now a part of their story, and I must respect them whenever I'm telling it. There is no part of my past that justifies the things that I have done. Who I am today in no way makes me exempt from being held accountable for the things that I have done in my past. I've learned that the most important part of change is seeking out that deep understanding of who I was and taking responsibility for the damage that I have caused. I most deeply and sincerely hope that nothing I speak about here will reopen those wounds. So this first essay kind of gives an idea about the person I was, and looking back at it and writing it now as an experience of my past, I changed my perspective on the events. It's called "There Are Very Fine People on Both Sides." It was hot, too hot to be standing in the sun. I was in the parking lot of a grocery store, frantically trying to fix the throttle cable of my motorcycle. I had pushed my bike up next to a light pole to get it out of the way of the traffic, and had the cable flopped up and over the handlebars while I worked to repair the broken end. I looked up and saw an elderly man shuffling towards me, frail and bent with age. He was wearing a wide-brimmed hat that kept the sun off his face and a gauze patch on the back of his hand where he might have bumped it, tearing his fragile skin. "Are you trying to tie up your horse?" he said, with a hint of an accent tucked in behind a wide grin as he slowly closed the last few feet of distance between us. But no sooner has he spoken the words, his eyes landed on the swastika blazed across the tank of my motorcycle. His face froze as he took a long look at me, taking in every detail until his eyes rested on the swastika painted on the toe of my boot. We stood facing each other in silence, him red-faced and bent with age, me crippled by hate. A long moment passed as I watched the courage well up inside him. "What are you, some kind of a Nazi?" he said, spoken more as an accusation than a question, as he shuffled a step closer. I could see the mixture of fear and anger on his face as he flicked his eyes from tank to toe to tank again. "Why, what are you, some kind of a Jew?" I said, spitting the word Jew out of my mouth as if just holding it on my tongue made me unclean. We stood under the weight of a summer sun, him sizing me up for the coward that I was, and me stumbling in my mind for answers as to what made this old man so bold. Whatever fear he might have had was now gone, lost in his outrage as he lifted his chin so that he could reach out past the brim of his hat with his eyes. I traced with my eyes the slump of his shoulders and the bent, swollen knuckles of his hands. Confused by the fear that welled up inside me as I stood face to face with the brittle, broken old man. He looked at me like he could read every cowardice thought that I've ever had, as if he could taste the fear that hate was covering up in my life. He could smell every secret that I had hid from the world through a facade of hate and anger. He cut me apart with his strength and fearlessness, exposing me to the world, leaving me empty and afraid. Unable to withstand his crushing stare, I slowly reached for the screwdriver that was sitting on the seat of the motorcycle, ready to bury it into his bent and broken body. But I froze. "Humph," he said, as if I wasn't worth his time, passing his eyes from screwdriver to tank to toe before wrinkling his nose and slowly shuffling away. No, there are not good people on both sides. There are cowards who hide their fear behind symbols of hate, and there are those who cripple them with cold, even stares. This next one is, it kind of gives an idea of the process, the beginning of the process of my change, which, it took many years to get to a point in my life where I was able to move forward, move away from the hate, move away from the violence, move away from the gangs. So it wasn't an overnight process, but there's certain milestones looking back, and one of them is a textbook that I got into my cell when I was in segregation. This is called A Textbook Case of Hate. There are some moments in life where the universe seems to take the wheel. These moments can be so large that they seem to have their own gravity, pulling you towards a new beginning. I had a moment like this a few years ago. I was in prison in the middle of a gang war, surrounded by violence and betrayal by everyone and everything that I believed in. Walking into prison 8 years earlier, in 2003, I carried with me two things: a 20-to-life sentence for murder and a lifetime of hate and violence. I was a white supremacist, embracing every ideology of hate. It's easy to hate the world around you when you hate yourself, and I had plenty of hate to go around. I was angry and hopeless, a perfect fit for the culture of violence within a prison. It didn't take long before I was recruited by a prison gang, and I quickly moved up the ranks. Within a couple of short years, I was the highest-ranking member in 2 prisons and was calling shots in both. I had everything a guy could ever hope for in prison: money, power, and respect. But as my gang started to grow in size and power, we started bumping heads with the other white prison gang in the system. It was always over something that seems so trivial to me today, but in the mix of prison politics, nothing was trivial, and it almost always led to violence. We would beef over everything from who controlled the card tables to who was being recruited. My gang was smaller than the other gang and had less influence, and as the violence ramped up, my homeboys started to drop out around me. Weeks went by where every day I would hear about another one making a deal with our rival gang to drop out, cover their gang tattoos, and promise to get me if they had the chance. These were my brothers, my family, the people I was ready to die for or to kill for. I couldn't believe they had turned their backs on me to save themselves. This was all happening while I was on a closed custody unit, which means that we were only allowed out of our cells for an hour a day and only a few cells at a time. The tier was broken up into groups of 4 cells, which were called walks, and each walk would get an hour a day to leave their cells and use the day room that stretched the length of the tier. The only other time we were allowed out of our cells was for an hour of rec time, which was held outside in long cages. As my homeboys dropped out, I became the only member of my gang on a tier that was otherwise filled with rival gang members. I lived alone, had day room alone, and went to rec alone. Everyone in my life had betrayed me and left me to fight it out alone. The prison administrators kept trying to convince me to leave the tier, but I refused. I didn't want to look like I was running. It would have looked like I was moving for protection, and I couldn't do that. I had to represent my gang. I told them that if they tried to move me, I would fight them, and they would have to use the extraction team to get me out of my cell, and after they put me on a new cell, I'd fight them again. I told them that I would never walk off that tier on my own 2 feet, and over the years, I had given them every reason to believe me. The prison was dealing with a lot of bad press at the time for being overwhelmed by violent gang wars. So the last thing they needed was me stirring things up all over the prison. So there I sat, alone and surrounded by my enemies. This was a private prison, run by a corporation instead of the state, and most of the violence was caused from within, meaning that the staff and the officers were responsible. Doors would mysteriously open, allowing rival gang members to get at each other. Gates would open on the way to the rec cages, leaving rival gang members trapped together. I watched one morning as one guy ran into another guy's cell when they popped the doors to hand out breakfast trays. The officer just shut the door, laughing as he let them fight it out. It was important for the administration to hide the amount of violence that existed under their watch, so most of my violence was off paper, meaning that there were no reports written or no disciplinary actions taken. I remember one time 3 of my homeboys and I went to the hole. The segregation unit was full of rival gang members at the time. The tier was so full that they doubled us up, so we were 2 to a cell, 2 at a time in the rec cages. The first day we were in the rec cages, I passed word to my homeboys to be ready. I could just feel that something was a little off. I had gotten a bad vibe from one of the officers, and I knew something was about to happen. About an hour later, it happened. I was standing at the sink of my cell when I heard all the doors popping one at a time. Click, 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 all the way down the line, coming closer and closer to our cell. My homeboy said, "Here it goes," just as our door popped. We ran out of our cell, fighting for our lives in a swarm of violence. When it was all cleared out, the tier was littered with pens, pencils, anything that could be used to stab or stick someone. And this wasn't the only time this happened to me. Doors were mysteriously opened on 2 other occasions. As time went on and the gang war intensified, my life became a lonely existence, punctuated by betrayal and plagued by uncertainty. Every hour out of my cell was a roll of the dice. I would come out every day alone with my senses tuned to the popping sounds of doors opening, never turning my back to the row of cells that faced the day room. I showered with a knife in one hand and slept with my shoes on. I carried a note to my sons in my sock saying goodbye and asking them to forgive me. I folded it neatly and wrapped it in cellophane to protect it from blood, hoping it would find its way to them after I was gone. The only certainty I felt in my life was the certainty that I would never leave that tier alive. Prison politics could be complicated. It's all about power, about who controls the economy within the prison. There are really 2 struggles within prison politics, race against race, each trying to carve out the biggest piece of the pie, or struggles within the race, trying to work out who takes the biggest bite. And this is where we found ourselves. The gang we were at war with was the largest, most powerful gang in the system. So when we were on the outs with them, we were on the outs with all the white boys. Every white boy with something to prove wanted a piece of us to show loyalty to the larger, more powerful gang. Every white boy on the tier may not have been a member of the other gang, but they were all under their influence, which meant we were on the outs, ostracized by the rest of the white boys. This went on for over a year, and as time went on, members of the other gang started coming to my door, asking me to drop out, cover my tattoos, and come back into the fold, meaning back with the white boys, back with my race. But I couldn't do it. I don't know why I wouldn't give up. I guess part of it was stubbornness, but mostly it was because my gang had meant everything to me. I'd given my life to it and was willing to give my life for it. I had a lot of friends in the other gang. We had done a lot of time together, and we were allies, but now we were enemies, and I couldn't wrap my head around why I was fighting my own race. My race had meant everything to me. I couldn't understand how I had come to a point in my life where I was trying to kill my own people, and my own people were trying to kill me. Some of those friends would secretly fish notes to my door late at night, saying how they had love for me and to keep my head up. But I knew that because we were now enemies, they would have to kill me if they had the chance. Excuse me. I had already been sliced up with a razor, and one of my homeboys had been put into a coma. His head caved in with a fan motor, so we all knew what the stakes were. It was in the midst of this chaos that it happened. I ordered a book from the library list. The library list was built by book titles and authors only, so when choosing a book, we had no way to know the genre. When the book showed up, it was a big green biology textbook with the name of some high school stamped across its glossy pages. I just tossed it aside with disappointment, planning to turn it back in. But a few days later, I picked it up and started reading it. I came to a chapter about genetics that talked about how when it rains out in the prairies, these big puddles formed, and how there's a species of frog that migrated from puddle to puddle. It talked about how these frogs were hard to study because they came in all different shapes, sizes, shades, and color patterns, and how these frogs would have to travel across the prairie from puddle to mate, because if they didn't, then there would not be enough diversity and the species would die out. The scientists can tell if the population was healthy just by looking at the diversity in each puddle. I had to read this several times. Something didn't seem right with it. The more I thought about this, the more it blew my mind. They were saying that diversity strengthened a species, and I couldn't understand how that could be possible. All my life, I had believed that diversity would weaken my race. I had believed that a pure race was a strong race. I was taught that we must secure our race for our children, keeping it pure, saving it from diversity. This book was telling me that everything that I had built my life around was wrong. The more I understood this, the more I started to wonder what else was false. And it wasn't long before all my ideologies of hate felt weak and thin. I will never forget the suffocating realization that all the hate, all the pain, all the suffering that I've caused in my life was built on lies. I realized that I hadn't even carried my own thoughts in my head, that I'd spent my life taking other people's rhetoric, amplifying it, and spewing it out as if it were my own. This outdated textbook, tossed to me like a life preserver, set me off on my journey of change. It was the power of thought and the strength of reason that would eventually crush all those twisted ideologies of hate that I had spent a lifetime consuming. That old textbook became a milestone in my life, a turning point, a symbol of what's possible through the power of truth, the power of independent thought, and the courage to change. Over the years, I've thought a lot about that textbook. Last year, I was asked by a professor at the University of Idaho to write a chapter for a book exploring the evolution of criminology. I was honored and amazed at the opportunity, and as I spent those many months researching and writing that chapter, it became clear to me just how much I had changed from the man that I once was. When the publishing date was announced, all I could think about was that old beat-up textbook that had found its way into my cell so many years earlier, and how it would be the second time that a textbook had marked a milestone in my life. I have no violence in my life today. I have no hate. Today I think for myself, feel for myself, and try to make the world a better place. I no longer live under false ideologies. I seek truth, not fear, and I no longer accept the loudest voice in the room as right. I remember when I was in segregation, I'd been in there for years, and all of a sudden, I couldn't flush the toilet without being shot back in my life to my childhood. And I couldn't figure it out. It was just the damp, musty smell of living in a concrete room and flushing that toilet. I dreaded doing it every time. And I finally started exploring that and came to realize that it was the trauma from my childhood that dictated, I think there's moments in your life that can dictate every other moment in your life. And I was able to trace back to that moment, and I wrote about it here. It's called Up and Away. If I had known that my path forward was going to require me to come to terms with my journey forward, come to terms with my past, I would have never had the courage to try. My journey to a life sentence and years of inflicting hate and anger upon the world began when I was 6 years old. My first contact with my father's side of the family was when my mother took me and my two sisters to meet our Aunt Mel. It was Christmas Day, and my mother didn't tell us where we were going or why. She simply dressed me and my sisters into our best clothes and loaded us up into the car. When the car came to a stop, we looked out the windows to see a big white house set back from the street at the end of a long walk. My mother pulled each of us from the car and lined us up along the sidewalk, tucking and straightening, pleading and threatening, but not explaining where we were or who we were about to meet. The woman who answered the door seemed larger than life. Her smile was warm and genuine as she introduced herself. When we walked in the house, I was amazed at the size of the Christmas tree that filled the living room. I remember the confusion I felt when this woman handed me a present and told me that it was from my dad. I was an intuitive child, so I could sense the lie, but always made well when I saw what she had given me. It was a World War II fighter plane. It was big and blue with decals of a wide grinning shark pasted across the nose and a giant engine poking out the top. It was more than just a toy, though. It had a big propeller and a real engine that ran on fuel and was tethered with string to a hand controller so that when it flew, you would turn in circles, operating the flaps on the wings to make the plane swoop and dive. I loved that plane as much as a boy could love anything. I would spend hours caressing it with my eyes, climbing into the cockpit and escaping into the clouds. I would try to fire the engine until my fingers would bleed, but I could never get it started. It became my dream to see that plane take to the air. I could just imagine myself twirling in circles as it roared up and out of sight, diving down to strafe the ground before swooping back into the sky. I begged every man that wandered into my life to help me fly my plane, but they were not that kind of men. A couple of years later, a man who was unknown to me, who was staying in our house for unknown reasons, offered to take me to the park to help me fly my plane. I begged my mother to let me go until she finally relented. She handed me a big box of Band-Aids on the way out the door and sent me on my way. I ran to his truck and held that plane in my lap as if it might fly away on its own. The entire drive to the park was spent peppering him with questions as I swooped and dove through the clouds in my imagination. When we got to the park, he walked me into the bathroom, dragged me into the stall, beat me and raped me. There was no luring or grooming. It wasn't that kind of a deal. It was angry and it was violent. When it was over, he ordered me to clean myself up before walking out, where he sat waiting for me in the truck, my plane waiting patiently in the seat beside him. I shuffled around the bathroom in a stupor. I felt like I had been electrocuted. My whole body was funny bone numb as I washed the piss out of my hair in the sink and the blood out of my underwear in the toilet. I could hear the radio playing on the truck over the ringing of my ears where he had slapped me, sending a white-hot flash of blinding light behind my eyes. When I was finished, I stood at the door without options, willing myself to walk out of that bathroom and climb into the cab of his truck, and we drove away with my underwear wet and soiled, balled up in the pocket of my jeans. When we got home, I carried that plane into my bedroom, covered it with a towel, and I smashed it into a pile of nothing. I stomped it and crushed it into bits of broken hope and smashed dreams, or tore at it with my teeth like a wild animal. Snarling through tears and pulling at my hair like a beast, I chipped and snapped away at it until my fingers bled. Then I carefully picked every piece from the carpet, wrapped it in my piss-stained clothes, and snuck it to the burn barrel at the end of the driveway, never to speak a word about it. For years to come, I would see this man's face in passing traffic and smell piss on my palms. I would wash my hands over and over, but without fail, whenever I cupped them to my nose, I could smell piss and shame. Not long after, my cousin came home saying that the same man had tried the same thing with him in the same park bathroom, but he was somehow able to fend him off. I remember standing there listening to my family laugh and cheer him on as a hero as I cupped my hands to my nose, hoping my secret was safe. I couldn't understand how he had escaped and I hadn't. I couldn't understand why, but fighting him off had never even occurred to me. Until that moment, the thought had never even crossed my mind, and it was in this moment that I started to believe that it was all my fault. From that moment on in my life, I would never again not fight. Never again would anyone take anything away from me. I took my shame and anger out on everyone close to me. I became cruel and violent to my cousins. I tried so hard to not hurt them, but it got so bad that my aunt wouldn't let me around them unsupervised. Whenever she spoke to me, I pretended not to notice the look of fear and pity on her face. As I moved into my teen years, my anger burned inside me like fire. I would break and smash anything at hand. I threw chairs and broke furniture. I would fly into fits of rage that resembled seizures. I hated the world. I hated myself, and I hated life. I hated with an intensity that consumed me. It became me, and it defined me. I held this secret shame for the next 40 years, stuffing it away deep inside my soul, holding it in the same dark hole that I held my hate. I would clench my teeth and squeeze tight my fists to hold it in place. I would drive it down into the depths of my soul with gulps of alcohol and stab at it with knives filled with dime bags of whatever I could get my unconscionable hands on. A lifetime later, I stood in an empty cell with cold cement floors, closed walls, and the echo of a flushing toilet that snatched me back to a dirty park bathroom. It was time to face my shame. I walked myself through every moment. I tasted the blood from swollen lips, and I smelled the filth. I heard the voice of shame rising up through my life, screaming racial slurs at the world. I traced every drink, every drug, and every act of violence back to that day at the park. And the more I felt, the more I could feel. I began to realize that there is no shame in being a child. There is no crime in innocence. And that I never did hate the world. I only hated the circumstances in which I was introduced to it. The more I understood the whys of my life, the more I understood the hows. How could I be so cruel? How could I hate an entire race of people? How can I feel so little? I started to understand. I understand that men are built piece by piece, cobbled together by their circumstances, and broken by the weight of what they carry. I understood that I had spent a lifetime breaking the world around me to feed my secret shame. I didn't know how, but I was determined to find peace in my life. I was determined to never again place a towel over the world and crush my shame away. By the time I walked out of that cell, it was hand in hand with a brave little boy cradling a fighter jet in his arms. I no longer hated him. I no longer blamed him. I lifted him up out of the filth of a bathroom floor, and I pulled him into my heart. I set out on a journey to face the world, ready to make right a lifetime of wrongs, and every time I find a way to right those wrongs, my heart soars like a fighter plane. And I always like to end this by saying that if you've experienced trauma in your life, then you're not alone. Don't ever let it define you. It's not insurmountable. Endure and find your path forward. This next one is another example of how your experiences define you. It's called A Conversation About Addiction. Sometimes it can feel like there's only 3 conversations in prison: money, drugs, or how tough you are. The other day I found myself in the classic "I can't wait to get high" version of these conversations. As the guy droned on and on about how much he was missing getting high, I found myself drifting away to a musty crawl space under the house I grew up in. I spent most of my childhood in a house built on the side of a hill outside of town. There was a crawl space under the high side of the house that was tall enough to stand in. It was here in the gravelly darkness of this crawl space that I got drunk for the first time. I couldn't have been more than 12 years old at the time. I have a lot of memories in this dark, empty space under our house, but none that I enjoy holding on to. It was in that crawl space that I hid from the man who had raped me a few weeks earlier. I noticed one day that he was packing his camper up to leave, so I scrambled down into the musty darkness and used the flap of an old cardboard box to slap and scrape away the spider webs, pushing my way into the darkest corner where I held my breath until he was gone. I laid there in the spidery darkness, waiting the day away, feeling sure that since so much of me now belonged to him, that if I was found, he would pack me up in that camper along with all of his other possessions and carry me off. So I lay there in the emptiness, huddled in the dark, imagining that he could somehow hear the sound of my heart beating its fist against my chest. I could hear the muffled voice of my sister calling for me as I lay frozen in the blackness. Feeling tickly things with tickly legs crawling on me as I swallowed the urge to cry out to her, pinching tight my eyes against the shame of what might re-happen to me if I was discovered. Even after he left, as weeks passed, I would often find myself slipping off into this same place to scream out into the emptiness. I would drop to my knees in the gravel, dig deep into my belly, bury my face in my hands, and let out long, silent screams. Silence so that nobody would be afraid of me. And when I was a little older, this is the place where I would hide away from my stepfather when he was intent on torturing me. I would stamp around in the dark with my fists clenched tight like hammers, listening to the sounds of his heavy footprints on the floorboards above me, hoping that someday I might be big enough to hurt him back. On the day that I got drunk for the first time, my mother had a party at our house the night before, and early the next morning I went around with a Kool-Aid pitcher, filling it with the warm, stale, leftover beer. I took that pitcher down to the crawl space and I chugged it down, soothing the shards of broken hope that churned inside my belly. I sat alone in the darkness, feeling warm and empty as the stale beer washed over my body. I chugged and choked at the pitcher until it was gone, and then I sat in the warm glow of its nothingness. Gone as if by magic was the fear and the shame that had haunted me. Gone was the anger and the hopelessness, chased away by the bitter warmth of stale beer. A lifetime later, in a different dark and empty room, I sat alone in my cell, facing the things that had fueled a lifetime of drug and alcohol addiction. I came to realize that my entire life had been spent numbing away the pain of my childhood. I realized that every drink, every shot, every ounce of pain inflicted upon the world was an attempt to not feel, to medicate away the pain and the shame and to hide. There are no happy drunk or fun high memories for me to look back on. Today, when I think about getting drunk or high, I think about that crawl space. I think about the child who found the first real comfort in his life in a pitcher of warm, stale beer. And I think about all the pitchers after that, all the shots and all the pain. I think about a child lost in his fear, screaming in silence, willing to do or to drink or to shoot anything into his arm to not feel. My mother is suffering from dementia. And when I think about Alzheimer's disease, I think about a cruel disease that preys upon your past, slowly eating away at all that you've ever been, robbing you of all your yesterdays. And when I think about addiction, I think about it the same way. A disease just as cruel, but one that preys on your future instead of your past, slowly eating away at all that you hope to be, robbing you of all your tomorrows. I slipped away from that conversation the other day with the feeling of that dark, musty crawl space resting on my heart with all the fear, the shame, and the anger that came with it. And then I walked back to my bunk, thankful that today I can feel things like fear, shame, and anger. Thankful that I no longer have to use drugs, alcohol, or hate to numb it away. Before I walked out on the conversation, the guy asked me if I was going to get fucked up when I get out. I just looked at him, shook my head, and told him no, I don't have to anymore. This next one means a lot to me. It's I've lost a lot of people in my life, and I wrote about a guy that I got to know really well and came to really care for a lot. And he suffered from mental illness, and it's so difficult for people who suffer from mental illness in the prison systems. And so this is his story. It's called My Friend Dan. My friend Dan was the nicest guy I've ever met in my life. He was kind of a big guy, kind of slow, shuffling around at hunched shoulders, like he carried with him the weight of the world. He spoke about things like books and music as if he was speaking about old friends. He loved poetry and rap music. He loved to work out, and he loved to make me laugh. Dan would share his poetry with me, verse after verse, scribbled on notepads, sketching out images of the shadows that lived within his mind. My friend Dan was mentally ill. I want to tell you about Dan, but I'm having a hard time with it. I'm having a hard time writing about anything right now. It just seems like every time I write, the story seems to end with me losing someone I care about. To be honest with you, it's starting to wear on me a little. I'm going to tell you about Dan, though, because his story needs to be heard. I don't think people realize how the system works for people who are mentally ill, and I don't think people understand how hard it is for those who work inside the system, whose job it is to help people like my friend Dan. The day I met Dan, he warned me that Carlos didn't like me. He's a little racist against white people, he said. He keeps telling me to spit on you, but don't worry, I won't spit on you. I said, what? Don't worry, I won't spit on you, he said. I told him, you tell Carlos, whoever the fuck he is, to come talk to me himself. But I soon found out that Carlos was the man who lived inside his head, the voice who tormented him day and night, berated him, belittled him, and drove him into madness. As me and Dan became friends, he would often turn his back on me in mid-sentence, unable to look me in the eyes for the things that Carlos was saying about me. And when he turned back to face me, he would look at the ground and apologize, ashamed about what was being whispered about his friend. Sorry. I would see him walking up to me wearing a smile that consumed his entire face, and watch it fade as he turned abruptly and walked away. I would call out to him, "Hey, Dan," and when he turned back, I would say, "Carlos is a punk," which would bring a smile back to his face before he hurried away. He would tell me, "Man, Carlos really doesn't like you." I'd tell him, "That's because he knows I'm your friend." Sometimes I'd tell him, "You tell stupid Carlos I'm going to punch him in his stupid face." He would always laugh and say, "No, that would hurt me." When Carlos was at his worst, Dan would find an officer and check himself into the hole. He would sit in segregation until his demon became manageable. Dan told me how much Carlos hated prison. He hated everything about it, and he hated Dan for bringing him there. He said he hates me because I won't kill myself. Dan spent a lot of years. Dan spent a lot of years on the medical tier in the maximum security prison. I'd seen this unit through the glass years earlier, and it's not a place you'd ever want to be. Once when I was in Max being escorted back from medical, the officer who was escorting me needed to drop some paperwork off at that unit. I'll never forget standing there listening to the deafening sounds of insanity, smelling the odor of piss and disinfectant, looking out across the unit filled with lost souls. When I met Dan years later, I couldn't help but respect him for the years he had spent on that unit. Dan would tell me about how his illness had destroyed his life. His story was heartbreaking. His family was the first to fall victim to Carlos's poison. His illness started to surface when he was young, in his early teens. We spoke a lot about this time in his life because at the time I had someone close to me who was going through the same situation. I suppose that's what drew me to him in the first place. I asked him once if it bothered him when I would ask him about it. He told me that he wished everyone would ask him about it. He understood that what he suffered from was an illness, just like any other illness, and he just wanted to be treated like anyone else. He wanted people to understand it as well as he did. Dan had a hard time with his medication. He explained that it was like giving himself the flu to cure the cold. He loved working out, but his medication robbed him of his drive. He hated being numb to the world around him. Just talking about his meds was enough to send Carlos off the deep end. Dan would bargain with Carlos about which medication was okay to take. I always knew when Dan was having a hard time. I would see him from across the tier and call him over, away from other people, and I would tell him that he needed to go see the clinician. He never said much when he was in that state, but I would see him leave the tier. Mental health clinicians in a medium security prison have one of the hardest jobs in the system. I can think of no other job so vital to people's health and safety, yet so limited in its options. It would be like walking through a cancer ward with a box of Band-Aids. These people genuinely care, but the system is simply not designed to function as a point of care for mental illness. Over the last 20 years, I've seen it with my own eyes. I knew a little old Mexican man who would pat his leg and whistle to his little dog all the way to the chow hall. I knew a guy who thought he had cameras in his eyes and was afraid he was going to see something and accidentally tell on someone. I even knew a guy who picked up radio stations in his head. There are deep cracks in the system when it comes to people with mental illness, and it's way too easy for people like my friend Dan to fall into those cracks and never crawl out. When Dan was getting close to going home, he told me that he would never come back. He said that Carlos would never let him. Prison was different for Dan than it was for the rest of us. I watched him struggle with it every day. Just being locked in his cell every night was like being tethered to a nightmare. He hated being in his cell, as this was when Carlos was most cruel. I was the tier janitor, and after lockdown every night, I would come out and clean the tier. We had special permission for Dan to come out and hang out with me whenever he was having a hard time. I would laugh to myself as I cleaned the day room, watching him go behind me with a rag, re-cleaning my every step. Sometimes I would look out my window late at night and see him walking laps around the tier with that familiar look of panic on his face. I wasn't living on the tier when Dan got out, but the day before his release, I ran to laundry to try to catch him while they were changing him out so I could say goodbye. I expected to find him in one of his episodes, but he seemed calm and excited to be going home. I looked him in his eyes and shook his hand. The handshake gave me hope. It was one of the rare times when he was able to hold eye contact with me. No one was telling him to spit on me or calling me names inside his head. He looked at me in the eyes and he said, "Thank you." I was in the chow hall when I got the news. Someone said, "Remember Crazy Dan?" My heart stopped as I said, "Yeah, why?" They said he's dead, shot by the cops. I just stood in a daze, leaving my tray on the table and walking out. Every time I see that table in the chow hall, I think about the way my ears shut out the noise of the world as I floated back to my bunk. I'm not sure what difference I can make. I know that the people who work behind these walls with those who suffer, like my friend Dan, truly do care. I just don't think that they have the resources to treat them. We seem to have merged two systems, mental health and corrections, into one, leaving huge cracks for people like my friend Dan to fall into. I don't have the answers, but I know it's broken. And I know that if we don't talk about mental illness, it will never be fixed. If we don't put names to the faces, then those that have suffered in silence will fade away and nothing will change. My friend Dan was the nicest guy I have ever met in my life. Sorry, some of these get hard for me to read. I apologize. Like I said, I lost my son towards the end of my stay in prison. I had made it 19 years of a 20-year sentence, and I was getting ready to see the parole board. And it was one of the hardest things I've ever dealt with in my life. And I wrote about it. This is called Broken. A kid showed up on my unit. He had been transferred from another prison, and since the first time I saw him, he reminded me of my youngest son. The kid just turned 19, but he looks closer to 15. He's rail-thin and wide-eyed, never venturing far from his bunk. He's a quiet kid doing all he can to not look scared, but you can only do so much. He walked up to me a couple of days ago and asked me what my name was. He said that he was told to find me when he got here, that a good friend and ex-homeboy of mine had helped him get his transfer. He said that the guy had even filled out the kite for him, that all he had to do was sign it, and the guy told him to find me when he got there, and I'd take care of him. I reached out and took the kid's hand. His handshake was small and frail like him. The kid said that he's only been in prison for a couple of months, and that he has 10 to 25 years to do. As he walked away, I told myself I wasn't getting involved, that I had enough going on in my life without worrying about some scared kid. I heard the breath go out of him as I said, well, settle in. It'll get a lot worse before it gets better. After he had gone, I looked over at my friend Bill, who had heard the conversation, and I said, he'll be fine. He'll figure it out one way or another. Then I walked away. It's funny how life seems to jumble things together sometimes. I had no way to know that 24 hours later my world would crumble away, and not long after that, this kid would end up saving me. In 1995, I was introduced to my youngest son in a prison parking lot. I remember standing there, blinking into the sunlight, looking down at a wiggly bundle of smiles blinking back at me, reaching out to clutch at my finger as if to assure me that everything would be okay. I clung to him like hope as I climbed into the back of my mother's van, and off we went, making promises to my heart as the prison shrank away in the distance. I don't think he left my arms for the next 7 years. Even when I was running the streets all night, I'd hurry home to pull him out of bed and share donuts and smiles. I started calling him Bubba before he could even walk. He was my Bubbalicious, my little Bubbalulu, my breath of fresh air. A couple of days ago, I got about 5 messages in a row saying, call me, please. Between deep, agonizing sobs, I was told that my youngest son, Bubba, my little breath of fresh air, had died in a car wreck. The only thing I could feel was the coolness of the wall where I rested my forehead as I tumbled away into nothingness. The world fell away, leaving me in an in-between place, somewhere between here and there, between right and wrong, between then and now. I found myself standing at my locker next to my bunk with my head in my hands, trying to breathe when I felt something heavy resting on my shoulders. I lifted my head to see my friend Bill standing next to me with his hand on my shoulder, asking me in a distant voice if I was okay. I turned to speak, but only a whisper came out, as if my son had become a secret, something so precious that I had to hide him away from the rest of the world. Bill leaned in close, and under the weight of his heavy hand, I whispered to him about my son. I whispered about hope and heartache. I whispered about karma. I whispered about a baby boy, fat, happy, and full of life. But most of all, I whispered about failure. When Bill finally spoke, he whispered back to me, as if he understood that I wasn't ready to share my son with an undeserving world. He said, the only way to get better is to heal others, he whispered. You need to put your thoughts and your energy into the people who need you, as he nodded towards the kid that was curled up sleeping on his bunk across the way. I looked up to see the kid's thin form tucked up under his blanket, huddled up like a lost child. Sleep has been impossible. I wake up worse than the day before. I can't shake the emptiness. I keep screaming over and over inside my head until my silent voice is hoarse and strained. I feel my heart shrinking away, hiding itself like a wounded animal. My thoughts are having thoughts of their own, happy, crushingly sad memories. I feel so numb, like I'm swimming in a world made of cotton. I can't outstrength, outthink, outwill the convulsing sobs that seize control of my body. So I woke that kid up this morning. He came awake with eyes wide with fear as I stood over his bunk. I said, wake up, kid, brush your teeth, you're working out with me. He put his feet to the floor without question and followed me out to the rec yard. Between sets, I asked him if he had anyone on the outside taking care of him. He said, I have a lady who's like an adopted mom to me. He said, I don't have a dad. He left me when I was 3. I just stood there, falling backwards in my mind as tears filled my eyes. I said, I just lost my son a couple of days ago. At the end of the workout, I said, look, don't worry, I got you. You just stay out of the drama, show up for every workout, and check with me before you do anything stupid, and we'll do this together. I spoke to my son Michael today. He told me how proud he was of Bubba for being such a great dad. He told me about the conversations he had with him just minutes before the accident. He said Bubba sounded happy, that he had caught a bunch of fish and that he was on his way home to be with his son. I can't think of a better way to die. My heart kicks at me whenever this kid looks me in the eye. He lifts his chin whenever he passes my bunk to look just a little taller. I told him, I know you have a long ways to go. I know how you're feeling, but I promise you'll be okay. And I stopped myself just in time as the word son tried to jump from my tongue and settle in comfortably on the end of the sentence. It's called hope and happiness. There's nothing better than having a window that opens up to the outside world. I sit on my bunk and I look out over the vegetable garden below me, thinking about how far I've come in my life. I can smell the cool water on the musty soil, the newness of life, sweet and fresh as it's carried in on the breeze. I watch the rows grow more full with each passing day, patiently waiting to see each row weighted down with the splashes of color, greens, reds, and yellows, crisp and full of flavor. I love to just sit and watch as the world passes by. I watch the sun as it hides itself in the evening, giving the world one last golden kiss, turning the razor wire into swirls of neon orange, topping the fence line like electric cotton candy before dipping down behind the hillside. I watch the officers as they parade through the main gate at the end of each shift, shaking away the feel of this place with a bounce in their step as they think no more about my side of the window. I sit and I drift away, thinking about a time when my life was much smaller, a life of cold, empty cells surrounded by cold and empty people. My son's funeral service is tomorrow. I plan to spend it at my window, wishing the day away. I think I'll wish for happiness, not the easy kind, but the hard kind, the kind you have to work for, the kind that sneaks up on you, the kind of happiness that you take for granted until you look back at it from a prison window. I remember a camping trip that I took with my 3 older boys when they were young, before they had a little brother to lose. We loaded up the tents and filled them with We loaded up the tent and filled the coolers with hot dogs and warm sodas. We drove for hours, and when we got there, I chased them down one at a time while they wiggled and squirmed to free themselves from my grip. I pinned them between my legs as I smeared sunscreen and great glancing blows across their each back and face before they worked their way free to run and play. They ran the day away, bringing back lizards and the tails of lizards, still twitching in self-defense. About noon the next day, I started to notice something strange. I called them over to me one by one and spun them around. They were each covered in bright red stripes, white handprints where I had done such a poor job applying their sunscreen. They looked like pink zebras, like 3 chubby little candy canes that had been dropped in the dirt. As the day wore on, they began to slow down, and by the end of that day, they were ready to go home. I spent the next day treating sunburns, applying aloe and long sticky stripes as they rolled around on the couch asking for ice cream. It doesn't get any happier than that. Sorry. I think tomorrow I'll sit at my window thinking about hope and wishing for happiness. Not for myself, but for my 3 pink zebras who lost their baby brother.
We'll do kind of a Q&A and answer a few of the questions people have submitted, but if you guys have thought of any more questions, we can still do more than this. But yeah, I'll ask you kind of what some of the audience came up with. Okay, so what do you see as the opposite of fear, or truth, or love? These are separate questions. Yeah.
Yeah. I've been told.
I'm mainly asking, what do you see as the opposite of fear? Do you see it as truth? Do you see it as love? Do you see it as what?
So I was told once that fear is the lack of understanding, and that's always kind of stuck with me, that it's hard to fear something once you truly understand it. And so I guess that would be my answer, yeah. If that makes sense.
The next question. Did you ever think you would have published a book and then presented readings at different events after you were released?
No. No, no, absolutely not. First of all, I never thought I'd be released. I never thought I'd survive. I had just always assumed that I would die in prison.
This next one, it's, can you talk about what you're doing now in the world of recovery and, you know, what that means relative to your own recovery? Where are you in that process?
Yeah, so I work at a recovery center in McCall. And I love it. It's the most fulfilling thing I've ever done in my life. I get to help people in their recovery, and I get to use my experiences to help people who suffer from, you know, or trying to recover from addiction or, you know, anything, you know, domestic violence or mental illness, or if you're trying to recover from anything in your life. And this center is able to help people through that. And I'm also working with to mentor people getting out of prison, so that it's a program called Day One, to where on the first day out of prison, we try to give them what they need to be successful. And it's the most amazing thing. I had this lady come into the center, and she sat down and she's just cried for about an hour before she could even speak. And she had been out of prison for less than 48 hours. And to be able to sit there and help run down resources for her, anything from clothing to food to gas cards, you know, it just, that day will stay with me for the rest of my life.
All right, I have one more, and then, love to take some more from the audience. What's the most valuable thing you've learned over the last year?
I think the most valuable thing it must be that I can't, or we can't do this alone, you know. If you want to fail, the quickest way to fail is to take your own path and to shut people out of your life, you know. We need partners. We need to partner up. We need to reach out. We need to speak out. We need to, you know, we need to bring each other closer.
Were there any programs, classes, or courses that were offered while you were in prison that were actually advantageous to you, or that you would encourage other residents to attend?
Yeah, they offer substance abuse classes and anger management and different classes like that. And for a lot of people, it's just cookie cutter, you know, I just got to get through this, you know. But I was at a point in my life where I loved it. I soaked it up. I couldn't wait for the next class. I wanted it. And,
so I want to verify, you're saying the drug and alcohol class specifically was the one that did the most for you?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I love the drug and alcohol, but also the anger management. I love that. I don't think I got enough programming, but I'm kind of different in that way. A lot of people think there's too much if they're trying to get out and go home and, you know, go through the, you know, it's just another hurdle to getting out, you know. So I think it's where you're at in your journey, you know.
Yeah.
When you came out on day one, what were your feelings? Were you fearful, hopeful, excited?
I wanted to go back. Day one, I got loaded into the back of a car, handed a cell phone, and I got about 20 miles down the road, and I'm trying to think of ways I could go back to prison. It was just too much, too overwhelming. I was car sick. I hadn't been in a car in 15 years. This phone was just, everything was just too much. And I wanted to go back.
So what happened on day two?
I toughed it out. I stuck it out, and I had great support from my family, my sister, and I took it slow, and a little bit at a time, I figured it out.
Yes.
If there's anything you could have changed about the prison system from your experience, what would that have been?
I believe that there's two ways to solve a problem. you got a front door and a back door. And I think that if I had a magic wand, I could put the resources into the front door rather than the back door. Let's stop people from ever reaching the prison, you know? Let's work on at the neighborhood level. Let's work on boys and girls clubs. Let's work on outreaches, resources, counseling, trauma counseling, addiction counseling. Let's get people. Let's expand drug court. Let's put the money there rather than warehousing or trying to solve a problem once it's become a problem.
Do we prepare people to be released?
Yes, it's getting better. It's getting a lot better. This director, I've been in the system for 20 years, and I've seen it change and progress, and it's unrecognizable now. Today, what's going on today in IDOC is amazing. It's groundbreaking, really. If you've experienced it for 20 years, they're trying to come up with ways to deal with trauma, people dealing with the traumas in the prison, and also people dealing, once they get out, with the trauma of being in prison. There's I can't remember their title, but there's people that are hired just to help people navigate the hurdles of being released. I think they're yes, reentry specialists. That's what they are. Yeah, which is 10 years ago you were just kicked out. You were just let out. Sometimes they would call a cab for you. That would be the extent of their involvement. So it's changing. Yeah.
Do you ever wish you could go back to that night? Do you ever wish, or do you ever think about her?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Do you ever plan on going to the place?
Which place?
Where it happened?
Possibly. For those that don't know, this woman here was very close to my victim. And she reached out to me after I got out of prison. Very angry, very justifiably angry. And we have managed to build a relationship. And it's amazing. Thank you so much. Everything I do, every word I write, everything I speak about my victims, it's for them, And thank you for coming. I love you.
Could you have gotten to where you are without being incarcerated? Did you have to spend that time incarcerated to get to this better place? Or was there a way for you to heal on the outside?
No. I would have never, no. And I could say without a doubt that prison was where I needed to be. I needed to be in prison. I deserved to be in prison. I deserved to do every day that I did, and then some. Me being here right now is a gift, and yeah, so.
Any other questions? Okay, couple more. Yeah.
I'm just curious, like, how typical of your story is among the gangs. Do you think trauma is a big piece of what lands people in that space? Or?
I think trauma is the main component of everybody in prison. Whether it's recognized or not, whether it's dealt with, or whether it's something that people even realize. And I think that if we could become more trauma informed and we can find ways to work on the people's trauma, it's another way to solve the problem before it becomes a problem.
So what would you think about getting Reef and Moss into a high school level of teaching?
Excuse me?
Reef and Moss?
Yes.
And trauma classes into, like, say, junior year or senior year?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I think you're not too young. You're never too young to start, healing from the trauma. Yeah, the younger the better, maybe. Yeah.
I saw a couple hands over here. Yes, sir.
Do you remember what that textbook was called when you, yeah, I want to know what textbook kind of was an awesome, but.
No, it's just an old high school biology textbook. Yeah. Yeah.
So you're saying you did anger management while you were in, and then now you've done outside counseling or inside too, I imagine. What do you think was more beneficial, the anger management as far as keeping some of the trauma like triggers down, or do you think the counseling was more beneficial, or what's best?
Yeah, the counseling I'm doing now is much more beneficial. But the anger management classes gave me a good platform to work from, a good stepping stone. Right now I go weekly to a counselor where I try to work through my own trauma. In my past, we do EDMR, which is a treatment for trauma, which is it's really helping me a lot.
Thank you, David.